are facing starvation due to a civil war.
The Rapid Support Forces have held the city under siege for more than a year, despite the calls for the RSF to ease the blockade with aid trucks ready to go. They have not indicated that they will. In terms of the cholera in Tawila in particular, there is some aid coming through, although it is a difficult journey for aid workers to Tawila because of security and bad roads. But, supplies are very limited, partly because of the access problems I mentioned, but also partly because of funding last week. The World Health Organization said it had received less than a third of the money for which it had appealed.
BBC correspondent Barbara Platt-Usher with that report. More details at srnnews.com.
Here's some good news from God's Word found in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Good news from God's Word, the Bible, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58.
Do you toss in bed rehearsing the cares of the day? Listen to Music Till Dawn, featuring sacred music and devotional thoughts all night long. That's right here on VCY America.
VCY America is KVCX Gregory and WVIW Bridgeport. Christian Information Radio.
History was made on today's date. Stay tuned for an American Minute with Bill Federer.
Over 3,000 American troops were killed or wounded when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 20,000 died on the infamous Bataan Death March, where Japanese forced starving prisoners to march through jungles. 100,000 died retaking Okinawa and other islands. Though devastating, President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb prevented an estimated 1 million casualties, and Emperor Hirohito surrendered Japan on this day, August 14, 1945. Father Cummings, a chaplain who was captured and died in the Philippines, told his men, "There are no atheists in the foxholes."
This has been an American Minute with Bill Federer. For a free transcript, call American Minute at 1-888-USA-WORD.
This Crosstalk program is pre-recorded.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on VCY America. It was April 2nd, 2025. President Donald Trump had a special event on the lawn of the White House in which he called it a day of economic independence. He called it Liberation Day. He said it was a day that would make America wealthy again. Here's a clip from the White House.
This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Well, he goes on from there, but friends, following this event and many days after, there was a hue and cry, not just from some nations around the world, but from opposing politicians, from the media, as if this was some new thing, some new idea that President Trump had concocted, had just come up with to poke nations in the eye. But friends, this was no new idea, and by the way, the trade deficit has been astronomical. Today, we're going to be taking an historical look at tariffs and a look at our modern-day situation, including now the fact that 12 states are suing the Trump administration regarding tariffs. Joining us today, we welcome William J. Federer. Bill is a nationally known historian, a special speaker. He's an author, president of Amerisearch Incorporated. He's a speaker on the American Minute daily broadcast. He has authored numerous books, including America's God and Country, Encyclopedia of Quotations, Who is the King in America, Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present, How the Deep State capitalizes, that is, on crises to consolidate control, and also the book Silence Equals Consent, The Sin of Omission. Bill, thanks for joining us here today on Crosstalk.
Jim, great to be with you.
So, Bill, we're going to be taking a historical look at tariffs, but let's first of all define, what is a tariff?
It is a tax on things imported into America from other countries. And it was the number one way that the federal government was financed for a century and a half. There was no income tax in America till the Civil War, repealed after the war, and then 1913 with the 16th Amendment. Mm-hmm. Prior to Woodrow Wilson, there was no income tax. The federal government got all its money through tariff taxes on imports being brought in from other countries.
Great, and we're going to look at that, Bill, but let me ask you this. Is there a constitutional basis for tariffs?
Actually, that's the only thing that the Constitution authorizes is tariffs. So Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution authorizes the federal government to collect duties and imposts, which is another word for tariff. Duties and imposts to help pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and the general welfare of the United States. Matter of fact, the Constitution specifically forbade an income tax. It forbade a direct tax by the federal government upon the people. And that's why they had to amend the Constitution with the 16th Amendment, because the Constitution forbade an income tax prior to Woodrow Wilson.
You know, that's so amazing. And friends, again, understand this. It is the Constitution itself that gives a basis for tariffs. And, Bill, there are many who think this is just some new idea that President Trump trumped up, and therefore they're opposed to it. But the whole implementation of these tariffs, they go all the way back to our first president, do they not?
Right. So George Washington's second bill that he signed as president was the Tariff Act of 1789, which imposed a 5% tariff tax on all imports. And the Secretary of the Treasury, and his job is to what? Raise revenue for the federal government. His name is Alexander Hamilton. And he created the Coast Guard to stop countries from smuggling goods into America without paying the tariffs. Right, because they would collect the tariffs at the docks where the boats would come in the ports. And so these foreign countries would say, hey, let's take our ship and maybe take it to some other different part of the coast where there's not a port, and we'll just row the stuff in and smuggle it in. And so Alexander Hamilton created the Coast Guard to catch merchants who were trying to smuggle goods into America without paying the tariffs. The fastest ships of the day were called cutters. And so these boats were called revenue cutters. Why? Because they were collecting revenue. Wow. They were really fast. They'd find some boat. Hey, you're trying to sneak stuff into America. We're gonna make you pay.
You know, and I want to again pause here, Bill, because, friends, many of you may not have realized this. That was the reason for the creation of the Coast Guard, to keep these illegal products coming into our country and trying to evade taxes upon them, the tariffs placed upon them. That's why we have a Coast Guard today. That's why it was established. And certainly that I think is being forgotten about, Bill. And I'm going to also have you bring Britain into the picture, too, because they really didn't want manufacturing. They wanted their goods to come over here and not manufacturing to be taken in our colonies, did they?
Right. And by the way, I put all this in a book called The Interesting History of Income Tax. But it starts with the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. Ireland burned peat moss, which is this mucky mud that they would dry out into blocks, and then you'd put it in your fireplace. But in Britain, they burned coal, which came out of the ground in coal mines. but the coal mines would fill up with water. And so in 1769, a guy named James Watt invented a steam pump to pump water out of the coal mines. But it quickly was adapted into a steam engine, which powered factories. And so these factories would make textiles, cloth, wool, leather items very inexpensively. But the British did not let factories be built in their colonies because they wanted the colonies to purchase the stuff made from these businesses in England. And so once America broke away from England, we wanted to build our own factories. But the English goods were so cheap, people kept wanting to buy the English goods, and we're just getting off the ground and having to capitalize and invest in all these machinery, and our stuff was expensive. And so the tariff taxes made the foreign goods more expensive. It was viewed as making them pay this extra amount for the privilege of getting access to our customers in America. And so Thomas Jefferson wrote, April 6, 1816, "It may be the duty of all to submit to this sacrifice to pay for a time an impost on importation of certain articles in order to encourage their manufacture at home." It's like, okay, we're going to have to buckle down. It might be a year or so of us having to pay more because of the tariffs, but that higher price will allow an incentive for businessmen to take the risks and invest and build factories on our own soil. And once we build these factories, then we won't be dependent on the foreign countries. So factories sprang up across America, mostly in the northern states.
We're talking industrial revolution, aren't we?
It's called the Industrial Revolution. And they had spinning jennies. And so instead of a woman sitting where you'd have a big pile of wool from off that you just shore off a sheep, and if you put it under a microscope, each thread, each hair of wool has little barbs on it.
Yeah.
And you pull it with other threads, and the barbs catch each other, and the more you pull it, the tighter it gets and the thinner it gets. And so these women would have to spin this thread on a wheel and then take the thread and weave it back and forth in a loom to make cloth, and then make the cloth into clothes. Very, very time-consuming. And so once they had the factories, it basically freed women up. And so they could buy a whole bolt of cloth, or better yet, ready-to-wear clothes. Gee, could you imagine that?
Yeah.
And then instead of the women sitting at a wash tub and washing the clothes and then hanging them on clotheslines, they could buy a washing machine, right? It would be a tub with a little thing to turn the clothes on the inside. And then instead of having to go to a well and carry buckets of water into the house, you could have indoor plumbing. So instead of outhouses, you could have a nice bathroom inside your house. And so it was the fastest rise in the standard of living in world history. And the greatest beneficiaries were the women who were freed up from these menial tasks. And then the factories made farm equipment and reapers. So the farmers, instead of having to pay lots of manual labor to walk through the field, they could have a harvesting reaper go through it. And so this caused the price of food to go down. And it was a win-win for the country. And so the tariffs, after Washington, they were up to around 12%. By the War of 1812, tariffs went up to 25%. In the year 1820, tariffs were at 40%, and by 1860, they were at 60%.
Wow. And that's...
So in 1850...
I'm going to have to continue on there, but Bill, again, those rates, as we see with the tariffs, and there are people who are saying, Donald Trump, you're out of your mind, but it started at 12.5%, friends, went to 25%, then to 40%, and by 1860, 60%. This was the time Abraham Lincoln was president, but go ahead and continue on.
Right. So the 14th president, Franklin Pierce, December 5th, 1853, said, "Happily, I have no occasion to suggest any radical changes in the financial policy of the government. Ours is almost, if not absolutely, the solitary power of Christendom, having a surplus of revenue drawn immediately from imposts on commerce." He's like, we're the only country in the world that's doing this. We have a surplus of money, and it's all coming from tariff taxes, imposed on commerce.
And again, no income tax at this time, correct?
No income tax.
Okay.
Now, Ben Siegelman wrote in an article in Commentary Magazine, March of 1962. The title of the article is "Tariffs, the Kennedy Administration in American Politics." And Ben Siegelman said, "In the early years of the Republic, all but about $20,000 out of the $4.5 million of Treasury income stemmed from tariff levies. Up to the Civil War, in fact, over 90% of the federal government's receipts came from tariffs."
Wow.
And so, but then the Civil War starts.
Okay, Bill, we're going to pause right there because we're up against a break. So, friends, keep in mind, 90% of the federal government's receipts came from tariffs. Then comes the Civil War, and that's where we're going to pick up after the break. And we'll tell you more about this because this is not some new idea from Donald Trump. It's in our Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. We did not even have a federal income tax when these tariffs were levied. We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, geologist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, if sedimentary rock is made up of sediments deposited by Noah's flood, where did the sediments come from?
Chris, it appears that before the flood, calcareous ooze made of tiny marine animals and secretions accumulated on the ocean bottom. Scooped up by the flood, they became today's limestone deposits. It also appears that the sandstone deposits came from created granitic rock, which eroded to yield the sand that are modern-day sandstones. Also, during the flood, intense volcanism occurred as the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, depositing huge quantities of volcanic ash. This became intermingled with other flood sediments to form a variety of rock types. Chris, I think the flood of Noah's day is a very important concept which we must understand if we ever hope to understand the world around us. Let's develop a Back to Genesis way of thinking.
Thanks for tuning in to Back to Genesis.
You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network. William J. Federer is our guest today. He is speaker on the American Minute. And friends, he is talking about this matter of tariffs, taking a historical look at tariffs. And I tell you, the media has just become unglued. A number of lawmakers have become unglued. States are taking President Trump to court over the matter of tariff implementation. But it goes all the way back to our Constitution. It goes all the way back, implemented here by George Washington and presidents after him. And friends, can you imagine no federal income tax? I mean, there was none up until this point. Bill has written about this in this book called The Interesting History of the Income Tax. We have copies of this available through Crosstalk, our way of saying thank you for your support of $20 or more. Though you'll get a good overview of it on the program today, there is so much more detail in the book itself called The Interesting History of the Income Tax. And again, it's available for donation of $20. You can reach out to our switchboard at 1-800-729-9829. That's 800-729-9829. Or you can go to crosstalkamerica.com, click on the Crosstalk store, and you'll find it in there as well. Well, Bill, it's so enlightening for many because as we pass tax day and people think, is this going to get worse? You know, are we going to see taxes in any form of relief? But to realize that there was a time not that far, long ago. I mean, over half our nation's history or leading up to that first 100 years, there was no income tax that had taken place. And you were just getting us to the point of the Civil War when that break came up. So why don't you pick it up from there, if you would?
Right. So the problem was that the southern ports were where lots of the tariffs were being collected. And there are some reports that before the Civil War, the South was basically collecting the tariffs that made up 90% of the federal government's income. So the federal government is relying on tariffs, and the majority of the tariffs are coming from southern ports like Charleston, South Carolina, like New Orleans. Well, when the Civil War starts, it was basically the federal government sending troops down to Fort Sumter to saying, you need to continue to collect the tariffs. And the South's like, no, we're not going to collect the tariffs. Why should we collect the tariffs and then forward the money to the federal government when you're wanting to free the slaves and we want to keep the slaves? So when the war starts, the South holds back the income, and the federal government's revenue drops off. And so Abraham Lincoln is facing an emergency. So what does he do? He pushes through an emergency income tax, the first one ever in American history. It's just temporary during the war, and it raises $750 million to finance the war. And but when the war ended, the income tax was repealed because the emergency is over, and now the tariffs collected in the southern ports can once again be funneled back to the federal government. So up to the 1900s, there was a 95% tariff on things brought into America from other countries. And America was in what's called the Gilded Age. We had so much money. I spoke once up in in Pennsylvania, and I went to Harrisburg, and one of the state reps gave me a tour of the Capitol. And it was built during this Gilded Age. And everything is so ornate and gold, leaf everywhere. I mean, it's like it's like a palace. But it just gives you a realization that during the time of William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, the country was really, really rich. And it was because of tariffs. Even in 1921, George Washington Carver, he's a scientist at Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama, and he helps the farmers to grow peanuts. And lo and behold, peanuts are being shipped in from China cheaper than what the farmers in the southern states can grow them for. And so the United Peanut Growers Association asked George Washington Carver on January 21st, 1921, to go up to Washington, D.C., and lobby the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee to ask for a tariff on peanuts imported from China. Could you imagine cheap stuff from China?
Wow.
And they passed it. It's called the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Bill of 1922. And then this is followed by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill of 1930. And so, again, the federal government was financed through tariffs. Well, where did the income tax come from? Well, we mentioned the 1% tax the Civil War tax, but it was Woodrow Wilson that pushed through a 1% tax on the top 1% richest people in the country. And the year is 1913. He actually taxed it onto a tariff bill. And the idea is that it's only going to tax the extreme wealthy, the Rockefellers, the J. Paul Gettys, the Astors, the Flaglers, the Harrimans, the Mellons, the Jay Goulds. It's not going to tax us, the people. And where did the idea come from to tax the rich? The German immigrants. And so Karl Marx is over in Germany, and they had centuries of elites and poor people, and the poor people had no upward mobility. They were just locked into this system. And so Karl Marx says, hey, let's overthrow the system and have the government redistribute the wealth. And not anticipating the fact that all you're going to get is corrupt people in office redistributing the wealth to their friends and then killing people that they don't like.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, these German immigrants come to America, and they are the ones that start forming unions, and they're the ones that start pushing for a redistribution tax on the rich. And the rich try to stop it, and then finally they realize they can't fight public opinion, so they cave. And they say, okay, but as soon as there's an income tax, we're going to start tax-free foundations. The Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation. So they could still control all their money. They just weren't taxed on it. I mean, you only need so much to live off of, and the rest of their millions they put into these tax-free foundations, and so they could still control it.
Mm-hmm.
And but then World War I started, and everybody said, well, we had an income tax during the emergency of the Civil War, and now we have another emergency of World War I, so I guess we'll stick with it. And so he pushes through this 16th Amendment in the year 1913. But it was just to soak the rich tax.
Yeah. Wow.
Then World War II starts, and Franklin Roosevelt expands the income tax to everybody. And this was a shock, and it caused something called outsourcing, and that's when you began to see businesses move overseas to avoid FDR's taxes. But a little detail, most people made around $5,000 a year. And when he first instituted this tax, nobody saved up extra money to hand over a pile of money to the federal government at the end of the year. So Franklin Roosevelt instituted paycheck withholding, and it was Beardsley Rummel was the chairman of Macy's department store.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Thanksgiving Day parade,
Yep.
Macy's.
Yep.
And then he becomes the head of the New York Federal Reserve. And he comes up with the pay-as-you-go tax. So it's taking a little bit out of your paycheck every week for the income tax. Then by the end of the year, it's already been paid. And even John F. Kennedy, when he is writing his things on taxes, he said, April 20th, 1961, in meeting the demands of war finance, the individual income tax moved from a selective tax imposed on the wealthy to the means by which the great majority of our citizens participate in paying. But he says introduced during the war in meeting the demands of war finance. And so prior to Franklin Roosevelt, prior to World War II, only the extreme wealthy paid income tax. But FDR expanded it, and then FDR instituted paycheck withholding. John F. Kennedy writes, April 20th, 1961, withholding on wages and salaries was introduced during the war, when the income tax was extended to millions of new taxpayers. So it's like, okay, it's this war that extended it, so we have to pay, and then they introduce this paycheck withholding. So whenever you see money taken out of your paycheck, that was an emergency effort to fight Hitler. Part of the Uncle Sam needs you, buy war bonds. It was a patriotic fight the Axis, pay your taxes was the billboard. But the fallout was when FDR raised the taxes, then after World War II, people realized, hey, we can rebuild Germany and Japan with brand new equipment. It's called the Marshall Plan. And so businessmen are going over there and rebuilding, and then they're producing stuff cheaper because of cheap labor. And also, there's no taxes over in these countries, or lower taxes, and there's no lawsuits, and there's less government red tape, and there's, no environmental EPA people, and so they could produce stuff really, really cheap. And then they could funnel it into America and sell it and compete with American businesses. But they ended up making so much money, they could donate money to politicians and then ask the politicians to lower the tariffs so they can bring their goods into America even cheaper, and then lower them again cheaper. And it would put out of business the American businesses until finally they'd go belly up, And now we're dependent on these foreign-made goods. And this is called free trade. So the advocates that are for free trade, they're like, lower the tariffs and let them bring stuff that's made cheaper because they don't have unions in those other countries. There's less, labor expense, and they don't have government red tape and everything, so they can produce stuff cheaper. And then some of these foreign governments would give subsidies to those factories so that it would help them produce stuff cheaper, so they could sell it cheaper and put out of business American businesses. And then, once we're dependent on these foreign-made goods, when it comes to negotiating time on foreign policy, they can threaten to withhold the goods to make so all the politicians that have been getting money from these foreign interests, then they begin to start screaming. And then the people that are used to the cheap stuff begin screaming. And we have to go back and reread Thomas Jefferson. It says, okay, look, people, you may have to pay a little more for a while because of these tariffs, but it's going to cause the factories to move back onto American soil. And once they move back, there'll be more jobs. There'll be more opportunity. There'll be more upward mobility. We'll be able to put immigrants to work in businesses rather than signing them up for welfare. And then they find out when you sign them up for welfare, they end up becoming Democrat voters. But
yeah, very interesting. We're going to pause right here. Bill Federer is with us, friends. We're taking an historical look at tariffs, really, and a historical look at the start of the income tax as well. We'll have some more discussion after the break, and we'll be opening some phone lines here shortly as well. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network.
The conflict between church and state dominates much of the 2,000 years of church history. But nowhere do we see this demonstrated as clearly as in Germany, where in the 16th century, Martin Luther sparked the Reformation. But in the 20th century, the same country forced the world to grapple with the horrors of Hitler's Germany. Join Dr. Erwin Lutzer in the presentation, The Swastika and the Cross, a 2.5-hour video journey in Germany taking you to Nuremberg, the Berlin Wall, and the early years and legacy of Martin Luther. As you watch this film, you'll discover what lessons we can learn from the past to avoid making the same mistakes in the future. The Swastika and the Cross contains a Blu-ray, a DVD, and a digital download, all together for a donation of $20. Call VCY America, 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network. William J. Federer is with us today. His website, AmericanMinute.com, and dealing with the historical look at tariffs today and certainly the income tax as well. He's written a book, The Interesting History of the Income Tax, where he gets well into all of these many matters that you can read more about them. It is available for a donation of $20 here to Crosstalk, our way of saying thank you for your support. If you'd like to obtain a copy, you can reach out to our switchboard at 800-729-9829. We've been having some issues with our toll-free numbers today, or you may reach the switchboard directly at 414-935-3000, 414-935-3000, and ask for the copy of the book, American History, The Interesting History of the Income Tax. Bill, as we are, our friends go to crosstalkamerica.com and click on the story, you'll find it listed in there as well. Bill, we saw that after, this cry went forth from Congress and from others, and even from some countries, yet other countries around the world recognized, what is taking place, and they started lining up. And even right now, despite the fact that there's a lawsuit going against the president right now, and states that are seeking to rebel in this regard, what's interesting is that there are countries that are in active negotiations right now, and supposedly even China. Right.
It's beginning to work. And so we need to be patient with the president. if you remember Argentina, when they got their new leader, Milei, if I'm pronouncing his name right, that he got rid of all the globalist debt that the country was in and got rid of all these one world government people and kicked them out. And for about a year, Argentina was going through a shuffling, and then it became more solid because it wasn't dependent on all these foreign interests, and it is now so solid that there are people and businesses investing in Argentina, and it's doing better than ever before.
Right.
And so Trump is just returning us to the way America was for the first century and a half, when we became the most prosperous nation on the planet with the highest standard of living, and it was all through tariff taxes and not through income tax. So that's why he's talking about, hey, we can reduce the income tax. We can even get rid of the income tax.
Right.
We'll have the tariffs that'll take care of it.
And
so
people think people think he's loony by saying that, but that's how it was in our country.
Right, and they are paying for the privilege of access to our customers. And then when you look at it, these other countries are buying a relatively small amount of stuff from us, but we're buying lots and lots of stuff from them. So it behooves them to, for example, China. We're buying stuff from China, but China's not buying stuff from us. So if they reciprocate by putting tariffs on stuff that goes into their country, it really doesn't make a difference because they're not bringing that much stuff over. I talked to a person years ago that worked for a company that made carburetors, and they had a factory in China, and they had workers that worked in the factory copied the exact carburetor, went down the street, opened a factory making the exact carburetor. And so the company goes to the Chinese government, and they go, you got enough business, you don't care, and they let them copy it. I mean, so these other countries, they don't play fair, and Trump has got enough backbone, and probably one of the few people, if not the only person in the world, that has dealt with these large sums of money and can negotiate this. And so we have to realize that the people that are screaming the loudest are the ones that are benefiting from the free trade.
Right, right.
That if you look at who's donating money to them, it's probably a lot of these ones that have some kind of foreign influence, and they don't want to lose their power. But Trump's just wanting to return us to the way the country was before Woodrow Wilson, before the income tax, and before FDR.
Interesting, a total of 100 nations are seeking to reach a deal with the United States. They've already got some 17 or so on paper, and I'm sure these are 18 on paper. These are numbers from just even several days ago, so that may have changed even at this point. But so the countries are lining up and recognizing, and there has been a huge trade deficit with these nations, taking back very little from U.S. manufacturing, and yet wanting all their goods to flood into our market here. Bill, we see also a number of states, though, that are lining up against President Trump. Matter of fact, we have, I think it's a total of 12 states that are suing the Trump administration, and they're calling it illegal tariffs that are coming from the president. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, they're not illegal, and presidents always have negotiated these things. And you had under Obama and Biden, they actually got us into wars without approval of the Senate, where it was supposed to be Congress has the power to declare war. But they would simply call it something else, some other maneuver or security issue or something. But they would get us into a war, send our troops over there, without having to have Congress approve it. So they're mostly blue states that are, and sadly enough, they actually have a death wish. They actually want Trump to fail. They actually want the economy to crater, because then people will think, they'll vote the Republicans out and put them in. And then, so for political reasons, they don't want Trump to succeed. But Trump's been very successful in almost everything that he's been a part of, and he has a sixth sense, so to speak, to know how to make things work, and he's taken his business sense into this office, and I think if the country will just stand behind him. And really what he's doing is, John F. Kennedy, his tax plan was adopted by Ronald Reagan. And here's a couple quotes from Kennedy. He said, "I've asked the Secretary of Treasury to report on whether present tax laws may be stimulating an undue flow of American capital to industrial countries abroad." So like, okay, we're raising taxes in America, and guess what? All the money's leaving the country, and they're building factories in other countries. And then Kennedy writes this, April 20th, 1961. "In those countries where income tax are lower than in the United States, the ability to defer payment of U.S. tax by retaining income in subsidiary companies produces a tax advantage for companies operating through overseas subsidiaries." It's like, okay, you squeeze the sponge, the water goes out. You raise taxes on the businesses in America. They're in business to make money. And if they can make more money by having their factory located on another soil where there's cheaper labor and there's no unions and there's no lawsuits and there's no red tape government and EPA, guess what? That's where all the factories are going to go. That's where all the jobs are going to go, and those other countries are going to get rich by selling stuff to us with the lower tariffs. But if we raise the tariffs, make it more expensive to have their factory over there, they're going to move the factories back over here. We'll have more jobs, and so the immigrants coming in can have some place to work rather than signing up for welfare, and the country will benefit off of this. John F. Kennedy writes this September 18th, 1963. "A tax cut means higher family income, higher business profits, and a balanced federal budget. Every taxpayer in his family will have more money left over after taxes for a new car, a new home, new convenience, education, investment. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his profits in his cash register or put it to work expanding his business. And as the national income grows, the federal government will ultimately end up with more revenue." So it's like, give people a tax cut, they'll have more money. What are they going to do with it? Spend it? Buy stuff?
Yep.
Well, then the factories will have to hire more workers to meet the increased demand. And if the factories got more stuff, they can get better machinery. Because after World War II, we're rebuilding Germany and Japan with brand new equipment, but our equipment's old-fashioned stuff. So Kennedy's like, look, give the business a tax cut. Now, the caveat is you only give the tax cuts to businesses located on American soil.
Right.
If you're just going to give over-the-board taxes, they'll keep their factory in another country. But you want to give a tax advantage to those companies that have their factories and hire American workers.
Friends, I'm going to open our phone lines here. Our number here to Crosstalk, and it's a different number than normally. We have having some issues with our toll-free number today, but here's the dial direct number. It's 414-935-3090. 414-935-3090 for our program today. If you have a question or a brief comment for Bill Federer today on this topic of tariffs, taxes, 414-935-3090 is our phone number here today. And again, if you'd like to obtain a copy of his book, The Interesting History of the Income Tax, we do have that available. Our way of saying thank you for your support of $20 or more to Crosstalk. And you may reach out to our switchboard at 414-935-3000. To get into our program today, it's 414-935-3090. Write the number down, 414-935-3090. And, Bill, it's very interesting, and I think it's important for people to point out many people are looking for an overnight change, an overnight fix to the economy, an overnight fix to the lowered prices of different products, overnight fix to lower income taxes. It doesn't happen that way, does it?
No, so we're $36 trillion in debt. There's no way we can even pay the interest on that. It's unsustainable. And so if you leave it the way it is, it's a slow train off the cliff. The country is going to collapse. The dollar is going to be worthless. So all the money we give Ukraine and all these other countries around the world, we're borrowing it from our kids. It's a debt that they're going to have to be stuck with. We don't have it piled up anywhere. We're going more in debt to give money away. And so this idea of debt came from John Maynard Keynes. He's an economist, that FDR liked. And Keynes came up with a debt-stimulated economy. What's that? Well, it's the Great Depression, and he says, okay, it's okay for the government to go in debt and spend money in the private sector to create jobs, and then those jobs will pay taxes, and the taxes will pay off the debt. And it looks really good on a chalkboard. But in reality, it never happened. Why? Because politicians realize that if they go and have the government go in debt and they spend money in their districts to create jobs, they'll get votes. But then the politicians never want to raise the taxes to pay off the debt, and they just kick the can down the road, and the next Congress is left with it. Yeah. But then they want to get more votes, and so they go more in debt so they can have pork pot projects in their district, and then they never pay it off, and then the next year, and so we got this $36 trillion debt.
Yeah.
You know, James Buchanan Jr.
Okay.
is a Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1986. And he got the Nobel Prize because he realized that politicians will do whatever they can to get elected. Yeah. He wins the Nobel Prize for that. He goes, why are they increasing the debt? It's like, okay, they're funneling money into their district, you know, and a bridge to nowhere type stuff.
Yeah, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll start our phone calls here. We don't have time to we'll call in before our first break. So, friends, write down the new number here today, 414-935-3090 to get through to us, 414-935-3090. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back in 1 minute here on Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewtube.com. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about music and worship. Have you seen the studies recently, though, on what's called the Mozart effect? Vigilant Fox has a whole article that I read today, and it just confirmed what, well, many of us already know. Music does impact your heart, your soul, your spirit. Have you seen the videos of dementia patients basically sitting there, disconnected from the world? And then all of a sudden, someone begins to play a hymn, and they know every word. Or the individual hears a piece of classical music, and they begin to sing along. Isn't it interesting, the impact that music has on the mind, even dementia patients? Many of us know this, of course, firsthand, playing hymns to seniors who respond immediately. It just confirms really what the Bible says about the importance of music and worship. I'm Brandon House.
Our phone number to Crosstalk today, 414-935-3090. 414-935-3090. Bill Federer is our guest, and let's go to Erie, Pennsylvania. Ruth, you're on the air.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
When Henry Ford wanted to sell his cars, he gave his workers a day off. Nobody was used to only working 6 days a week, and he gave them $1 more. I can't remember if it was a week, a day, an hour, but because they had extra money and time to kill, they bought his cars. When are we going to catch up to common sense? Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting concept there.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Our number, 414-935-3090, 414-935-3090. Samuel in Wisconsin, you're on the air.
Yes, hello, gentlemen. I'd like to ask your guest a question. When was FDR did he establish Social Security, and what was the average life expectancy time at that time that he did that?
Yeah, well, I think it was in the 1930s during the Great Depression. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but the Social Security started with Abraham Lincoln taking care of widows during the Civil War, and then taking care of the maimed soldiers, and then taking care of their families, and then it went to taking care of other people that were hurting, and then gradually to everybody. And people were concerned because the Social Security issued a number, and they were afraid that the government would want to track everybody with the number. And the government swore up and down that this number will never be used for identification purposes.
Yeah.
But obviously they lied.
Yeah, the cards used to say that. I just did a quick search. It looked like life expectancy around that time was 60 years for men and 64 for women. That's kind of an interesting, that was a quick AI search, Bill. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. But
no, it was definitely lower than it is today.
Yeah. Let's go to Pat in Linden, New Jersey. Pat, you're on the air.
I agree that we have to bring manufacturing back to the United States. However, won't the cost of tariffs fall on lower-income people, whereas income tax generally doesn't? And I'd like to know what his thoughts are on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, the tariffs will make the cheap stuff from China more expensive for a period of time. But it will cause factories to come into America, so we'll have more jobs to hire the poor people, and they'll have more opportunities financially to get ahead, so they won't be poor anymore because they'll be able to make a lot of money from their jobs. So it is a long-term thinking that we have to realize that what we're doing right now is unsustainable. That, yes, you could continue to buy cheap stuff from China, but $36 trillion debt, where debt is fat to the body politic. If you can imagine somebody in an emergency room and they weigh 500 pounds, and the Democrats come in and say, oh, you can handle a couple more 100 pounds of fat, and then the Trumps come in and it's like, no, we need emergency surgery. We got to put in stents. We got to stop, eating what you've got, because debt is it's like fat. You eat something you shouldn't, but then you got to carry around the fat cells. And they're not brain tissue, they're not muscle tissue, they don't produce anything, but you got to carry them around. Debt is you spend money you shouldn't, but then you got to continue to pay interest on it, and then they pay that interest onto the kids, and then they print more money and inflate the currency, so the dollars buy less, and so the poor people's dollars don't buy as much.
And you're hurt in the long run. But let me again say that when you bring the manufacturing back within the borders of the United States, that's what will bring the prices back down again. And so that is something that is President Trump is seeking to do. Jocelyn is calling from Fort Worth, Texas. You're on the air.
Hi, how you doing?
Fine, thank you. Your question or comment?
Good.
Hi. I agree that our debt is out of control. My only question is, we were talking about income tax and how that came around, and then during the Industrial Revolution, we had all this manufacturing. My question is, if we're bringing back manufacturing, but we want to cut all the red tape and regulations, what's keeping our quality of life from plummeting to how it was for a lot of people during the Industrial Revolution?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so in the Industrial Revolution, we saw the highest rise in the standard of living in human history. And so people could have indoor plumbing, you could have bridges and railroad and transportation, and and so immigrants would come over and they would work in the factories and live in an apartment and all pack in there, but then they would save their money, and the next generation they would buy a business and buy a farm, and then they would move up and they'd go down to the port and hire more poor immigrants, and they would be cheap labor, because this is before the days of unions. And so it's this understanding that what's happening right now is unsustainable. Every major civilization in history has collapsed because of debt. The Mongolian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire. After the Louis XVI helped us during the Revolutionary War, he got nothing in return but debt, and then France collapsed, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed because of debt. Russian Empire, the Tsar, and then we had their arms race with the Soviet Union, and they tried to keep up, and they went in debt, and the Soviet Union collapsed. We're voluntarily doing to ourselves what we did to collapse the Soviet Union. We're incurring all this debt, and we're giving it away in all these free benefits to immigrants, and we're giving it away to foreign countries. It's unsustainable.
Thank you for the call. Let's get to Jeffrey in Caledonia, Wisconsin.
We got to do something.
Jeffrey, you're on the air.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. I was just wanted to share that a friend of mine graduated from college and was hired as a teacher. I believe it was a grade school, and they told her they wouldn't be teaching any history before the Civil War.
Wow. That's a tragedy, and as we have interviewed Bill on so many issues through the years, that is certainly a tragedy. Bill, you got 15 seconds. Your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a socialist tactic called deconstruction, where you separate people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you can brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. So when the Chinese would take over, they would destroy the history. When the Soviets take over, when the Islamists come in, they destroy history. So every conquering country wants to destroy the history that the country that they're conquering had, and then they want to, it's like a gene replacement therapy. They want to put in their identity, and it's a socialist tactic. And so when we read the history, then it's giving back a memory to our country.
Bill Federer, our guest here today on Crosstalk, his book, Interesting History of the Income Tax. We have available a donation of $20, available at 414-935-3000. Bill, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to all the callers.
And friends, check out his website, AmericanMinute.com. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.